Hello, my name is Elizabeth Gino, and this is my final presentation for History 202 on the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I chose this topic because I have always had a big interest in World War II, but never really gone into huge detail in learning about the bombing at Pearl Harbor. I think that there is a lot to learn from World War II, and there has always been something more interesting and more mind-blowing for me to learn. In this presentation, I talk a little bit about what Pearl Harbor was like before the bombing, and I tried to focus a lot on the Japanese internment after the bombing and the effect that that had on the Japanese Americans in the United States. Polynesians have inhabited the Hawaiian Islands for centuries. Hawaii was discovered relatively late by Europeans. The first visit by Westerners to the islands was in 1778, when the British captain James Cook arrived. The English ship Butterworth under Captain William Brown entered Honolulu Harbor in 1793. Captain Cook passed it on his famous voyage in 1778, but did not enter because there was coral at the entrance of the harbor. The coral rock was blasted away in 1902, and sand rock was dredged to allow large vessels to enter. The violent interference with the harbor was said to upset the shark goddess, and Hawaiians soon predicted trouble. Many tragic incidents followed as work continued in Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, the residents of Honolulu, Hawaii, awoke to the sound of gunfire. At 8 a.m. that morning, Japanese planes flew over Pearl Harbor, which was the U.S. naval base located just outside of Honolulu, and dropped bombs on the harbor and the surrounding airfields. More than 1,500 crewmen died, and 2 ships sank to the bottom of the harbor. The day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Congress voted and declared war on Japan, thus entering World War II. President Franklin D. Roosevelt described the day of the attack as a date that will live in infamy. The why of the attack is a little bit more complicated. A short answer is that the Japanese felt that as an Axis power that they would eventually go to war with the United States in the Pacific Ocean. By attacking and disabling the Pacific Fleet of the United States, which was stationed at Pearl Harbor, they hoped to cripple the Pacific Fleet and the morale of the United States, bringing her into submission, and a peace treaty favorable to Japan. In all, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor crippled or destroyed nearly 20 American ships and more than 300 airplanes. Dry docks and airfields were likewise destroyed. Most important, 2,403 sailors, soldiers, and civilians were killed, and about 1,000 people were wounded. But the Japanese had failed to cripple the Pacific Fleet. By the 1940s, battleships were no longer the most important naval vessel. Aircraft carriers were. And as it happened, all of the Pacific Fleet's carriers were away from the base on December 7th. Some of them had returned to the mainland, and others were delivering planes to troops. Moreover, the Pearl Harbor assault had left the base's most vital onshore facilities, such as oil storage depots, repair shops, shipyards, and submarine docks, intact. As a result, the U.S. Navy was able to rebound relatively quickly from the attack. After the Pearl Harbor attack, and for the first time during years of discussion and debate, the American people were united in their determination to go to war. The Japanese had wanted to goad the United States into an agreement to lift the economic sanctions against them. Instead, they had pushed their adversary into a global conflict that ultimately resulted in Japan's first occupation by a foreign power. Following the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, Americans reacted with fear and hostility toward those of Japanese descent living in the United States. Official government apologies and reparations for the great economic, social, and personal hardships suffered by the internees were decades in coming. During World War II, acting in what was later declared by Congress to be a time of racial prejudice and wartime hysteria, the U.S. government interned 120,000 of its own citizens and legal immigrants of Japanese descent. On short notice, people were forced to sell, give away, or abandon their belongings, including their cars, houses, farms, and businesses. Internment camps operated from 1942 to 1946. Shortly after the war ended, the government offered minimal reimbursement to the internees for their property losses and no apologies for the injustices involved in the internees' experiences. It was not until 4 decades later that the injustices involved in the internees' It was not until 4 decades later that Congress officially apologized for these governmental abuses and made reparations of $20,000 to each surviving internee. Immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor, suspicions began to focus on Japanese immigrants who lived in Hawaii and on the West Coast. Japanese people had begun to immigrate to the United States during the late 19th century. Immigrants themselves were known as the first generation. The early immigrants remained aliens because even those Japanese who had immigrated legally were prohibited from becoming citizens through naturalization. Their children, however, were U.S. citizens by reason of their birth in the United States. They were known as the second generation. By 1940, according to U.S. Census data, there were almost 127,000 Japanese immigrants and their descendants living in the United States, and another 158,000 living in the territory of Hawaii. They thus constituted only 0.02% of the overall U.S. population and about 2% of California's population. The first and second generation faced a great deal of prejudice, but as a group they managed to overcome such challenges to become an economically successful people, often owning businesses, farms, and houses. In the days following the attack on Pearl Harbor, arrests began of Japanese aliens who were thought to be a threat. The arrestees were primarily first-generation men, many of them leaders within the Japanese American community. By mid-February 1942, more than 3,000 men from the West Coast and Hawaii were in custody. In those early days of U.S. participation in the war, the Treasury Department also froze the bank accounts of all the first-generation Japanese Americans. All borders also were closed to anyone of Japanese ancestry. As the weeks passed, however, some Americans were not content with these measures. Some politicians, some military officials, and some in the media argued that more action was necessary. Questions of loyalty were raised, and arguments were made, fueled by prejudice and fear that both first and second generation Japanese Americans would join the fight against the United States by engaging in acts of espionage and sabotage. Beginning in March 1942, the process of interning moved forward rapidly. DeWitt issued a series of civilization exclusion orders in the spring of summer 1942, commanding all persons of Japanese ancestry to report to be evacuated. The orders typically provided 1 week's notice. This proved not nearly enough time for anyone to pack up his or her life and satisfactorily arrange financial affairs. Those to be interned stored what they could, and after the war reported that pilfering was common, and attempted to sell the rest. It was without a doubt a buyer's market, and most personal belongings, such as vehicles, houses, businesses, and farms, were sold for a small fraction of their worth. Internees were allowed to bring little with them. bedding, extra clothing, and what personal effects that they could carry. The first stops for internees were assembly centers. These were hastily converted from other uses, such as fairgrounds and horse race tracks. Internees reported living in stalls that until the previous week had housed horses. In general, the accommodations were barely fit, if that, for human use. The assembly centers operated for about 6 months, as the War Relocation Authority hastily built 10 camps in isolated areas. The government's name for these camps was relocation centers, but the term by which they are most commonly known is internment camps. While historical debate continues regarding the necessity of the attack for Japan and the United States' lack of preparedness, the Pearl Harbor attack unified the U.S. people and eliminated whatever isolationist sentiment still existed in 1941. Within a few days, the United States was at war with Japan, and because of the Tripartite Act, with Germany as well. It was only a matter of time before American military capacities were decisively exhibited in both the Pacific and European theaters. With the complete defeat of the Axis powers, in the case of Japan almost exclusively at the hands of American forces, provoked by the Day of Infamy to exact total victory over Japanese forces, symbolized in part by the American insistence of Japanese unconditional surrender. These are my sources. I got a lot of my information from the Pearl Harbor Reservations website. I got a lot of information from my History.com source. My source called Japanese Internment, and my source called Bombing of Pearl Harbor from the Salem Press Encyclopedia are my sources from JSTOR. I got a lot of my information from the website for the history of Pearl Harbor before the attack. I think I had a lot of fun learning about what Pearl Harbor was like before the attack, and it was very educational to look more into Japanese internment camps. I hope you all enjoyed this presentation, and I hope it was educational, and I hope you learned something. Thank you for listening.